Clean the bathrooms again, Natalie. And this time, actually scrub the tiles. Our clients shouldn't have to see the filth you missed yesterday. That's what Victoria Steinberg, the office manager at Meridian Digital Solutions, said to me on a rainy Tuesday morning, completely unaware that her precious company was actually owned by my father, CEO Theodore Kensington. My name is Natalie Kensington, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been treated like dirt by people who had no idea they were standing on land that belonged to you? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 8 months, I scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans, and mopped floors at the marketing firm in downtown Riverside Heights, while my coworkers stepped over me like I was invisible. They had no clue that the cleaning girl they loved to humiliate was actually the daughter of the man who signed their paychecks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how this whole twisted experiment began. It started during my senior year at Westfield University. While my sorority sisters were planning post-graduation trips to Europe funded by Daddy's credit card, I was sitting in my dorm room having a heated argument with my father over video call. "Natalie," he said, adjusting his tie in that familiar way that meant he was about to deliver life-altering news, "you've never worked a day in your life. You have no idea what the real world is like." He wasn't wrong. I'd grown up in the sprawling Kensington estate in Beverly Pines, attended private schools where my biggest worry was whether the cafeteria would serve sushi or lobster for lunch, and spent summers at our lake house in Montana learning to sail instead of learning to work. My father had built Meridian Digital Solutions from nothing, a small advertising startup that grew into a multi-million-dollar empire with offices in 12 cities. I was supposed to join the company after graduation, eventually taking over the family business, but there was one problem. I had absolutely zero understanding of what it meant to work for a living. "I've made a decision," Dad continued, his steel-gray eyes boring into the camera. "You're going to spend 1 year working at our Riverside Heights office. Not as my daughter, not as an executive trainee, but as a regular employee. You'll start at the bottom, earn your own way, and prove you understand what our workers go through before you ever set foot in a boardroom." I laughed. Actually laughed. "Dad, that's ridiculous. Just put me in marketing or something. I have a degree in business administration, for crying out loud." "Natalie Rose Kensington," he said, using my full name the way he did when I was 7 and had broken his favorite golf trophy. "You will work under an assumed identity. You will not tell anyone who you are. You will learn what it means to be treated based on your work ethic, not your last name. If you refuse, you can kiss your inheritance goodbye and figure out your own career path." That's how I became Natalie Ross, recent college graduate with a fake resume, fake references, and a very real chip on my shoulder. I moved into a modest apartment in Riverside Heights, a far cry from the penthouse lifestyle I was used to, and applied for entry-level positions at Meridian's satellite office. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially interviewing to work at my own future company. The Riverside Heights office was smaller than our main headquarters, employing about 40 people in a converted warehouse space that my father had deliberately kept humble. "It keeps us grounded," he'd always said during board meetings. What I didn't realize was just how grounded, meaning completely degraded, I was about to become. I applied for a junior marketing assistant position. I had the qualifications, the education, and honestly the natural talent for creative campaign. But Victoria Steinberg, the 40-something office manager with a perpetual scowl and a voice like nails on a chalkboard, took one look at my budget interview outfit. I'd deliberately dressed down to fit my new persona, and made a decision that would change everything. "Marketing is full," she said, barely glancing at my resume. "But we do need someone for facilities maintenance. It's mostly cleaning, some basic repairs, organizing supply closets. The pay is minimum wage, but it's honest work." I should have walked out. Should have called my father and demanded he override her decision. But something stubborn in me, the same trait that had gotten me into trouble my whole life, made me nod and accept. "When do I start?" "Monday," 6 a.m. sharp, and don't expect any special treatment just because you went to some fancy college. Here we judge people by their work ethic, not their degrees. If only she knew that her judgment was about to become the most expensive mistake of her career. That first day I arrived at 6 a.m. to find a supply closet that looked like it hadn't been organized since the Clinton administration. A list of cleaning tasks longer than my college thesis, and absolutely no training or guide. Victoria handed me a mop, pointed toward the bathrooms and said, "Figure it out." For the next 8 months, I became the office ghost. I arrived before anyone else, cleaned up their messes, restocked their supplies, and left after everyone went home. I watched from the supply closet as they planned campaigns I could have designed better in my sleep. I listened to them complain about corporate decisions that my father had made, completely unaware that corporate's future CEO was currently elbow-deep in their toilet bowl. But it wasn't just the work that broke me down, it was the way they treated me, like I was less than human. Like I was a piece of furniture they occasionally remembered to bark orders at. And Victoria Steinberg, she was the worst of them all. Every day brought a new humiliation. A fresh reminder that in her eyes, I was nothing more than hired help who should be grateful for the privilege of cleaning up after my intellectual superiors. What none of them realized was that I was documenting everything, every insult, every unfair demand, every moment of cruelty, because my father had taught me one crucial lesson about business: information is power. And I was about to teach them just how powerful information could be when it came from someone they should have treated with respect from day one. The reckoning was coming. They just didn't know it yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thing about being invisible is that you see everything. And what I saw during those first few weeks at Meridian's Riverside Heights office would have made my business ethics professor weep. My daily routine was simple, soul-crushing, and perfectly choreographed to remind me of my place in the office hierarchy. I'd arrive at 6 a.m., when the building was still dark and silent, my keycard labeled facilities maintenance instead of my real name, granting me access to a world that technically belonged to my family but felt like a foreign planet. The supply closet became my headquarters, a cramped space filled with industrial cleaning chemicals, broken office chairs that nobody bothered to fix, and a small desk where I'd eat my lunch alone while listening to my coworkers discuss projects through the thin walls. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was literally working in a closet while my childhood bedroom back in Beverly Pines was larger than most people's apartment. Victoria Steinberg had made it crystal clear from day one that I was the lowest rung on the ladder, and she took every opportunity to remind me. "Natalie," she'd call out across the open office space, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for addressing service workers. "The conference room needs to be spotless for the Henderson Industries meeting. And I mean spotless. These clients are worth more than your annual salary." What she didn't know was that Henderson Industries was one of our family's oldest clients. I'd sat in boardroom meetings with James Henderson since I was 16, learning about account management over expensive steaks at the Metropolitan Club. Now I was scrubbing coffee stains off the table where those same discussions would take place. The other employees weren't cruel exactly, they just didn't see me. I was background noise, part of the office infrastructure like the copy machine or the water cooler. They'd have entire conversations about weekend plans, company gossip and career ambitions while I mopped around their feet, as if I was a piece of mobile furniture. There was Derek Thornfield, the creative director who loved to leave passive-aggressive notes about how the design studio wasn't properly maintained after he'd spent all night chain-smoking and leaving empty energy drink cans scattered across every surface. He'd graduated from the same university as me, probably sat in some of the same lecture halls, but when he looked at me, he saw nothing but a janitor who wasn't doing her job well enough. Then there was Amanda Wells, the account manager who treated the office like her personal king. She'd schedule important calls during my cleaning times, then complain loudly to Victoria about how the help was disrupting her work. Amanda drove a BMW that my father's company essentially paid for, wore designer clothes funded by Meridian's generous commission structure, and lived in a downtown loft that she constantly bragged about affording through her own hard work. The junior employees were almost worse because they were so desperate to prove they belonged. Jessica Park, fresh out of college just like me, would actually step over my cleaning supplies with an exaggerated sigh, as if my presence was a personal inconvenience. She'd talk endlessly about her career trajectory and how she was destined for management, completely oblivious to the fact that she was discussing her future with the person who would eventually decide it. But it was during the weekly staff meetings that the real entertainment began. I wasn't invited, of course. Facilities maintenance didn't need to know about company strategy or client updates, but the conference room shared a wall with the supply closet, and the acoustics were surprisingly good when you pressed your ear to the right spot. That's how I learned that the Riverside Heights office was struggling. Revenue was down 15% from the previous year, they'd lost 2 major clients to competitors, and there were whispers about potential layoffs. Victoria spent most meetings deflecting blame, pointing fingers at everything from market conditions to insufficient corporate support. What we need, she declared during one particularly heated discussion, is fresh blood in leadership. People who understand what it's like to work in the trenches, not ivory tower executives who've never had to fight for a client. The bitter irony was delicious. Here was Victoria, criticizing my father's leadership style while making me scrub the floors that his money had paid for. She had no idea that her ivory tower executive had specifically designed this experiment to ensure his daughter would understand exactly what it meant to work in the trench. My apartment in Riverside Heights became my sanctuary, though sanctuary was a generous term for the cramped one-bedroom space with paper-thin walls and a heating system that sounded like a dying whale. After growing up with a personal chef, having to learn how to cook ramen noodles felt like a survival skill. After years of having a housekeeper, doing my own laundry was a weekly adventure and potentially ruining my limited wardrobe. But the hardest part wasn't the work or the living conditions. It was the complete absence of respect. At home, people listened when I spoke. My opinions mattered, my ideas were valued, my presence was acknowledged. Here I was a ghost who occasionally received orders. Every night I'd call my father to give him updates on my character-building experience, though I carefully edited out the worst humiliations. I told him about learning the value of hard work and gaining perspective on employee relations. I didn't tell him about crying in the supply closet after Victoria berated me for using the wrong toilet paper brand, or how Derek had actually thrown a crumpled paper at me when I accidentally interrupted his creative flow. "How are you finding the work environment?" Dad would ask during our weekly check-ins. "Educational," I'd reply, which was technically true. I was learning things they didn't teach in business school, like how quickly decent people could turn cruel when they thought someone was beneath them, and how power dynamics could corrupt even the smallest interaction. What my father didn't know was that I'd started keeping detailed records of everything, not just the daily humiliations, but the operational inefficiencies I observed, the client complaints I overheard, the interpersonal conflicts that were affecting productivity. I had a unique perspective as the invisible observer, and I was documenting it all in a leather journal I kept hidden in my apartment. I told myself it was just a coping mechanism, a way to process the experience, but deep down I think I knew I was building a case because something was shifting inside me during those long days of scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans. The naive girl who'd laughed off her father's challenge was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. They thought they were teaching me humility. What they were actually doing was giving me a masterclass in how power really worked, and how devastating it could be when it suddenly shifted into the hands of someone they'd underestimated. The reckoning was still months away, but the foundation was being laid one humiliation at a time. The moment I realized what this experience was really teaching me came during my 3rd month, on a particularly brutal Thursday that started with Victoria screaming at me over a coffee stain that wasn't even my fault. "This is exactly why people like you stay in positions like this," she snarled, pointing at the small brown spot on the conference room carpet. "No attention to detail, no pride in your work, no understanding that excellence isn't negotiable." I stood there holding my cleaning supplies, watching her face turn red with manufactured outrage, and something clicked. This wasn't about coffee stains, or carpet care, or even cleaning standards. This was about power, who had it, who wanted it, and how people wielded it when they thought no one was watching. The stain had been there when I arrived that morning. I'd seen Derek spill his espresso during yesterday's late-night creative session and walk away without bothering to clean it up. But Derek was untouchable. Creative talent, Victoria called him, while I was expendable. So the stain became my fault, my failure, my character defect. I understand, I said quietly, kneeling down to scrub a stain that had already set into the fibers. Excellence isn't negotiable. Victoria smiled with satisfaction, completely missing the irony that she was lecturing about excellence while running an office that was hemorrhaging clients and bleeding money. But I was starting to understand something my father had been trying to teach me all along: the difference between positional power and earned authority. Victoria had positional power, a title, a salary, the ability to make my life miserable. But she hadn't earned the authority that should come with leadership. She ruled through fear and arbitrary cruelty, not through competence or vision, and the results spoke for themselves in the company's declining performance. That afternoon, I had what you might call an epiphany while organizing the supply inventory, a task that revealed just how dysfunctional this office really was. We were paying premium prices for basic supplies because no one bothered to negotiate contracts. We were ordering replacement equipment for items that could be easily repaired. We were spending thousands on external consultants for projects that could be handled in-house if anyone had bothered to assess our actual capability. I found invoices that would have made my father's CFO weep: $200 for light bulbs that cost $15 at any hardware store, $500 monthly for a cleaning service that was doing half the work I was doing alone, consulting fees that exceeded some employees' annual salaries for advice that any competent manager should have been able to provide. But what really opened my eyes was discovering a folder labeled Employee Concerns in Victoria's filing cabinet while cleaning her office. I wasn't snooping. The folder was sitting open on her desk, practically begging to be noticed. Inside were complaint forms, suggestion submissions, and formal grievance reports from the past 2 years. Reading through them was like discovering a secret history of workplace dysfunction. Jessica Park had submitted 3 different proposals for improving client communication protocols, all marked filed, no action required in Victoria's handwriting. Derek had actually written a detailed analysis of why the office was losing creative talent, complete with recommendations for improving workflow and employee satisfaction. Victoria had written creative types always complain across the top and shoved it in the folder. Most heartbreaking was a letter from Amanda Wells from 18 months ago, back when she apparently still had hope for positive change. She'd outlined a comprehensive strategy for client retention, identified specific problems with current account management, and volunteered to lead a committee to implement solutions. Victoria's response was a handwritten note: "Stick to what you know, management decisions aren't your concern." I sat in Victoria's empty office that evening, surrounded by evidence of her incompetence and cruelty, and finally understood what my father meant when he talked about earning respect versus demanding it. These employees weren't failing because they lacked talent or motivation. They were failing because they were being systematically undervalued and ignored by someone who saw leadership as a license to humiliate rather than an opportunity to elevate. The irony was overwhelming. Here I was, the future owner of this company, literally cleaning up the messes created by someone who was actively destroying everything my father had built. Every harsh word Victoria spoke to me was essentially an insult directed at her own boss's daughter. Every arbitrary rule she enforced was a slap in the face to the family that employed her. But more than that, I was beginning to understand the real lesson my father wanted me to learn. It wasn't about appreciating hard work or understanding the value of a dollar, though those were important. It was about recognizing that true leadership meant seeing people for who they really were, not just the role they happened to occupy. Derek wasn't just the creative director, he was a talented artist who was burning out because his ideas were being filtered through Victoria's incompetence. Amanda wasn't just the account manager, she was a strategic thinker whose insights were being wasted because Victoria felt threatened by anyone with good ideas. Jessica wasn't just the junior employee, she was an ambitious professional whose potential was being crushed before it could develop. And I wasn't just the cleaning girl, I was someone who would eventually have the power to change everything about how this office operated. That night I called my father with a different kind of report. Instead of just updating him on my personal growth, I started asking questions about leadership philosophy and company culture. "Dad," I said, pacing around my tiny apartment. What makes someone a good leader? He was quiet for a moment, probably surprised by the shift in my usual complaints about sore backs and cleaning chemicals. Why do you ask? I'm seeing things, I said carefully, patterns in how people treat each other, how decisions get made, how problems get solved or ignored. I want to understand the difference between managing people and actually leading them. Leadership, he said slowly, is about making other people better at their jobs, not just better at following orders. A real leader creates an environment where people can succeed, not one where they're afraid to fail. I thought about Victoria's leadership style: rules without reason, criticism without guidance, power without purpose. She managed through fear and maintained control through humiliation. She created an environment where people were afraid to suggest improvements, afraid to take initiative, afraid to be anything more than exactly what she told them to be. What happens when leaders forget that? I asked. They stop being leaders, Dad replied. They become obstacles. And eventually organizations find ways to remove obstacles. As I hung up the phone that night, I realized I was no longer just enduring this experience. I was studying it. Every interaction with Victoria was a lesson in how not to lead. Every conversation I overheard was insight into the real challenges facing this office. Every document I filed away was evidence of systemic problems that could be solved with better leadership. I was still months away from revealing my true identity, but I was already beginning to see myself differently. Not as Victoria's victim or my father's spoiled daughter learning a lesson, but as someone who was gaining invaluable intelligence about how power really worked when people thought no one important was watching. The girl who had laughed off her father's challenge was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that respect wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned through competence, integrity, and the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. Victoria had no idea that her daily lessons in cruelty were actually preparing me to be everything she wasn't: a leader worth following. The day everything changed started like any other, which is probably how most disasters begin, with the illusion of normalcy before the world shifts beneath your feet. It was a Friday in late October, the kind of crisp autumn morning that made Riverside Heights look almost picturesque despite the industrial buildings and cracked sidewalks. I'd arrived at my usual 6 a.m., armed with my supply cart and the growing sense that I was documenting the slow-motion collapse of a workplace that should have been thriving. The Henderson Industries presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m., the same client I'd known since childhood, though they had no idea that the woman mopping their conference room had once helped her father strategize their advertising campaigns during summer internship. Victoria had been preparing for weeks, treating this meeting like her personal audition for corporate recognition. What she didn't know was that Henderson Industries was considering pulling their account. I'd pieced this together from overheard phone calls, scattered documents, and the general air of desperation that had been building around the office. James Henderson himself was flying in from Seattle, never a good sign when the CEO makes personal visits to satellite office. I was in the supply closet organizing inventory when I heard Victoria's voice cutting through the morning quiet like a buzzsaw through silk. Where the hell is the presentation folder? Someone moved my Henderson file. The panic in her voice was unmistakable. I poked my head out to see her tearing through her office like a woman possessed, papers flying, desk drawers sliding out with violent force. Derek and Amanda stood in her doorway looking helpless, while Jessica cowered behind her computer screen. It was right here yesterday, Victoria continued, her voice climbing toward hysteria. Right here on my desk. Someone must have moved it during cleaning. That's when her eyes found me, and I saw the exact moment when desperation transformed into rage. She crossed the office space in long, purposeful strides, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. You, she said, pointing at me with a finger that trembled with fury. What did you do with my Henderson files? I haven't touched any files, I replied calmly, which was true. I'd learned early in this job to avoid Victoria's desk entirely, except for basic dusting and trash removal. Don't lie to me, she snarled, stepping close enough that I could smell her anxiety. Coffee breath mixed with stress, sweat and desperation. Those files don't just disappear. You were in my office yesterday, cleaning around my desk. What did you do with them? The entire office had gone silent. Everyone was watching this confrontation unfold, and I could see the calculation in their eyes. Stay quiet and let the cleaning lady take the blame, or speak up and risk becoming Victoria's next target. Victoria, Derek said tentatively. Maybe they're just… Shut up, Derek. This is between me and the person who's apparently too stupid to understand that some things shouldn't be touched. She turned back to me, and what happened next was the moment that changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone watching. You know what your problem is, Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the silent office. People like you think you can just coast through life without consequences. No education, no ambition, no respect for other people's success. You're exactly where you belong, cleaning up other people's messes, because you're too incompetent to create anything worthwhile yourself. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest, not because of the insult itself, but because of what it revealed about who Victoria really was when she thought she had all the power. You're a nobody, she continued, apparently mistaking my silence for intimidation. A replaceable, forgettable nobody who should be grateful that someone like me is willing to employ someone like you. So, when I ask you what you did with my files, you better find a better answer than I don't know. I looked around the office at faces that ranged from uncomfortable to mortified. Derek was staring at his shoes. Amanda was studying her computer screen with intense concentration. Jessica looked like she might actually be sick. None of them said a word. That's when I realized this wasn't really about missing files or even about me. This was about Victoria's need to demonstrate her power over someone she considered powerless. She was performing dominance for an audience, using my humiliation as entertainment to distract from her own professional failure. I understand you're stressed about the Henderson meeting, I said quietly, but I haven't moved your files. Stressed? Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I'm not stressed about anything. I'm annoyed that I have to waste time dealing with incompetence when I should be preparing for the most important presentation of the quarter. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to what she probably thought was a threatening whisper but was still loud enough for everyone to hear. Let me explain something to you, Natalie. In the real world, there are people who matter and people who don't. People who create value and people who clean up after the value creator. You are definitively in the second category, and you need to remember that before you start thinking you can lie to someone in the first category. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. Here was Victoria lecturing me about creating value while running an office that was hemorrhaging money and driving away clients. Here she was talking about people who mattered while systematically destroying the morale and potential of every talented person under her management. But what really crystallized everything for me was watching my coworkers' faces during this performance. I saw Derek wince when Victoria called me incompetent. The same Derek whose creative ideas were consistently ignored. I saw Amanda close her eyes when Victoria talked about people who don't matter. The same Amanda whose strategic insights were dismissed as overstepping. I saw Jessica's hands shake when Victoria mentioned lying. The same Jessica whose honest feedback was labeled as insubordination. They weren't just watching Victoria humiliate me. They were watching her demonstrate exactly how she viewed all of them whenever they stepped out of line or showed the slightest sign of independent thinking. The Henderson files are probably in your briefcase, I said finally. You were reviewing them yesterday during lunch and took them with you when you left early for your dentist appointment. Victoria's face went through several interesting color changes as she processed this. She stalked back to her office, grabbed her briefcase from behind her desk, and pulled out the missing folder with a violence that suggested she was imagining it was my neck. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge her mistake, just glared at me with the kind of hatred usually reserved for people who had personally wronged her in some unforgivable way. Get back to work, she snapped. All of you. And Natalie, I want this entire office spotless before the Henderson meeting. Every surface, every corner, every inch. If there's so much as a dust particle out of place when our clients arrive, You'll be looking for a new job. I nodded and returned to my supply closet, but something fundamental had shifted. The girl who had been willing to endure this treatment for the sake of her father's lesson was gone, replaced by someone who had just seen the true face of workplace tyranny. As I gathered my cleaning supplies, I could hear Victoria in her office practicing her presentation, her voice confident and professional, a complete transformation from the panicked, cruel woman who had just tried to destroy someone she considered beneath her notice. But I wasn't beneath her notice anymore. I was studying her, analyzing her weaknesses, documenting her failures, and for the first time since starting this job, I wasn't thinking about enduring the experience. I was thinking about ending it. The Henderson meeting was 3 hours away, and Victoria had no idea that her performance of power over the cleaning girl had just signed her professional death warrant. The 3 hours between Victoria's public humiliation and the Henderson Industries meeting felt like the longest of my life. I moved through my cleaning routine like an automaton, polishing surfaces that were already spotless while my mind raced through possibilities, consequences, and the weight of a decision I wasn't sure I was ready to make. I kept replaying Victoria's words, "You're a nobody, a replaceable, forgettable nobody." The cruelty wasn't just in what she said, but in how she said it, with the casual confidence of someone who believed she was stating an obvious fact rather than delivering a devastating insult. She hadn't been angry in that moment, she'd been educational, explaining the natural order of things to someone too stupid to understand her place in the world. But what haunted me more than her words was the silence that followed them. Not one person in that office had spoken up. Not Derek, who I'd watched struggle with his own treatment under Victoria's management. Not Amanda, who'd written passionate proposals for improving workplace culture. Not Jessica, who was barely older than me and should have understood what it felt like to be dismissed and devalued. They'd all just stood there, grateful it wasn't their turn in Victoria's crosshairs. I found myself scrubbing the same section of conference table over and over, my hands moving in mechanical circles, while my thoughts spiraled between rage and doubt. Part of me, the part that had been raised to be reasonable, diplomatic, to always consider multiple perspectives, whispered that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just workplace hierarchy in action. Maybe Victoria was under pressure and had lashed out unfairly, but that didn't make her a monster. But another part of me, the part that had been carefully documenting months of systemic dysfunction, knew better. This wasn't an isolated incident or a moment of poor judgment. This was Victoria revealing who she really was when she thought there would be no consequences for her actions. I thought about calling my father. It would be so easy to pick up the phone, explain what had happened, and let him handle it. One call from Theodore Kensington to the regional manager, and Victoria would be gone by lunch. The Henderson meeting would proceed smoothly, the office would get new leadership, and I could finish out my year of character building under someone more reasonable. But that would also mean admitting defeat. It would mean I couldn't handle the challenge my father had set for me, that I needed Daddy to rescue me from the big bad office manager. More importantly, it would mean missing an opportunity to understand something crucial about power, leadership, and how systems really change. Because what I was wrestling with wasn't just personal hurt or wounded pride. It was a fundamental question about how people like Victoria gained and maintained power, and what it took to effectively challenge that power. I pulled out my phone 3 different times to call my father, and 3 times I put it away. Each time I felt like I was choosing between 2 different versions of myself: the protected daughter who could solve problems with inherited authority, or someone else entirely, someone who had earned the right to make changes through understanding rather than birthright. The moral complexity was eating at me. Was it fair to use my hidden identity against Victoria? She didn't know she was attacking the CEO's daughter, which meant her cruelty was genuine, rather than strategic. In some ways that made it worse. She wasn't trying to curry favor with power or eliminate a threat. She was simply exercising what she saw as her right to humiliate someone she considered beneath her. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about my own motivation. Was I planning to reveal my identity because it was the right thing to do for the office and the employees, or because I wanted revenge for being personally insulted? Was I thinking like a future leader addressing systemic problems, or like a privileged kid who'd finally encountered someone who couldn't be impressed by her last name. I sat in the supply closet during my lunch break, eating a sandwich that tasted like cardboard while staring at the leather journal, where I'd been documenting everything: months of observations, inefficiencies, employee complaints, and management failure. Evidence of an office that was failing not because of market conditions or corporate neglect, but because of leadership that actively undermined its own people. The Henderson meeting would be telling. If Victoria pulled it together and successfully maintained the client relationship, maybe her personal cruelty could be overlooked in favor of professional competence. If she failed, if her stress and poor preparation led to losing one of the company's most important accounts, then her treatment of employees wasn't just morally wrong, it was professionally destructive. I realized I was essentially conducting an experiment. Could someone who treated their subordinates with contempt and disrespect still be effective in their core responsibilities? Was Victoria's cruelty a character flaw that could be separated from her job performance, or was it fundamentally connected to her inability to lead effectively? The answer would determine not just what I did next, but how I understood the relationship between personal integrity and professional competence. At 9:45 a.m. I positioned myself near the conference room, ostensibly organizing supplies, but actually preparing to observe the most important meeting in this office's recent history. Through the glass walls, I could see Victoria arranging materials with the kind of manic precision that suggested barely controlled panic. James Henderson arrived exactly on time, accompanied by two executives I didn't recognize. He looked older than I remembered from family gatherings, his hair gone completely gray and his face carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades making difficult business decisions. He greeted Victoria with professional courtesy but without warmth, the kind of politeness that suggested he was here to deliver news, rather than receive a presentation. As they settled into the conference room, I caught a glimpse of Victoria's face through the glass. She was smiling with the kind of aggressive confidence that looked more like desperation than assurance. Everything about her posture screamed of someone trying too hard to project authority she wasn't sure she possessed. I thought about the employees sitting at their desks outside the conference room trying to focus on their work while knowing their jobs might depend on how well Victoria performed over the next hour. I thought about Derek's creative proposals that had been dismissed, Amanda's strategic insights that had been ignored, Jessica's enthusiasm that had been systematically crushed. Most of all, I thought about the choice I was facing. I could continue being Natalie Ross, the cleaning girl who'd learned valuable lessons about workplace hierarchy and the importance of treating people with respect, or I could become Natalie Kensington, someone with the power to actually change things. The debate raging in my mind wasn't really about Victoria anymore. It was about what kind of leader I wanted to become, and whether I was ready to accept the responsibility that came with having the power to make real changes. As I watched Victoria begin her presentation through the glass walls, gesturing enthusiastically while James Henderson's expression remained carefully neutral, I realized that the next hour would determine not just the fate of this office, but the direction of my own transformation. The girl who had started this job 8 months ago would have cleaned around the edges of this meeting and hoped for the best. The woman I was becoming understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for people is refuse to let their tormentors continue operating without consequences. But first I needed to see if Victoria would destroy herself or if I would need to help the process along. The Henderson Industries meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes, and I watched every excruciating second of it through the glass walls of the conference room while pretending to organize filing cabinets that were already perfectly organized. What I witnessed wasn't just a failed business presentation, it was a masterclass in how poor leadership destroys everything it touches, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. Victoria started strong, her voice projecting confidence as she launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed opening about Meridian's commitment to client success, but within 10 minutes, cracks began to show. James Henderson asked a simple question about quarterly performance metrics, and Victoria fumbled for numbers that should have been at her fingertips. The exact figures. She paused, shuffling through papers with increasing desperation. Well, they're trending positively across all key indicators. Henderson's expression didn't change, but I saw his assistant make a note. In the business world, trending positively without specific data was code for I don't actually know what's happening. Things deteriorated rapidly from there. When Henderson asked about the creative team's bandwidth for upcoming projects, Victoria made the fatal mistake of throwing Derek under the bus. Our creative director has been struggling with time management lately. We may need to bring in additional freelance support to ensure quality deliverables. Through the office glass, I could see Derek's face go white. He'd been working 12-hour days for months, producing exceptional work despite Victoria's constant interference and arbitrary change. Now she was blaming him for delays that were entirely due to her micromanagement and last-minute revisions. But the real disaster came when Henderson brought up the elephant in the room: client retention rate. "We've been reviewing our account distribution," he said carefully, "and we're concerned about some trends we're seeing in the Riverside Heights office specifically." This was Victoria's moment to acknowledge the problem's present solutions and demonstrate leadership. Instead, she went into full defensive mode. "Any retention issues are primarily due to market volatility and increased competition," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Our team has been working incredibly hard despite receiving limited corporate support and dealing with resource constraints that frankly make our achievements even more impressive." I watched Henderson's face during this response, and I saw the exact moment he made his decision. It wasn't anger or disappointment, it was the cold, calculating expression of a CEO who had just confirmed what he'd already suspected. "Miss Steinberg," he said quietly, "we've lost 3 major accounts this year. Your competitors are operating in the same market conditions, with similar resource constraints, yet they're growing while you're shrinking. Help me understand what we're missing here." Victoria's response was everything I'd come to expect from her: leadership style, deflection, blame shifting, and a complete inability to accept responsibility. "Our account losses were due to clients making unrealistic demands and expecting unreasonable timelines," she said. "The Brennan Corp situation, for example, was entirely due to their constant scope changes and unwillingness to pay fair rates for premium work. Riverside Marketing Group was clearly just price shopping and never intended to maintain a long-term partnership. As for Davidson Industries," she continued for another 5 minutes, systematically explaining why every lost client was wrong, unreasonable, or impossible to satisfy. Never once did she mention internal improvements, team development, or strategic changes. It was a litany of excuses that revealed exactly why this office was failing. Henderson let her finish, then asked the question that sealed her fate: "What's your plan for improvement?" Victoria's plan, such as it was, involved requesting additional budget for marketing initiatives, hiring more senior staff to elevate the team's capabilities, and implementing stricter performance metrics to ensure accountability. In other words, her solution to the office's problems was to spend more money, bring in outside talent instead of developing existing employees, and create more punitive oversight. She wanted to fix dysfunction by adding more layers of bureaucracy and control. I found myself gripping my cleaning supplies so tightly my knuckles went white. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had created the current problem. Victoria genuinely believed that the office was failing because people weren't being managed strictly enough, not because they were being managed poorly. Henderson asked one final question: "How would you characterize the morale and engagement level of your current team?" "Excellent," Victoria replied without hesitation. "We maintain high professional standards, and the team understands the importance of meeting expectations. There's a strong culture of accountability and performance-driven results." I actually had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. Victoria had just described her reign of terror as a positive work environment while sitting 20 feet away from employees who spent their days walking on eggshells and suppressing their ideas. The meeting ended with polite handshakes and Henderson promising to review everything we've discussed today and get back to you with our decision. In corporate speak, this was the equivalent of "Don't call us, we'll call you." As the Henderson team packed up their materials and headed for the exit, I saw James Henderson pause at Derek's desk. "Nice work on the Morrison campaign," he said quietly. "That was innovative thinking." Derek looked surprised and pleased but also confused. Victoria had never passed along any feedback about client satisfaction with his work. Henderson moved on to Amanda's desk and made a similar comment about her account management skills, then stopped at Jessica's workstation to compliment her on a client communication strategy he'd apparently heard about through other channels. It was clear that Henderson had been doing his own research, talking to clients directly about their experiences with the Riverside Heights office, and what he'd learned had nothing to do with Victoria's version of events. After Henderson and his team left, the office fell into an unnatural quiet. Victoria retreated to her office and closed the door, never a good sign. The rest of the team sat at their desks, pretending to work while obviously processing what they'd just witnessed. I continued my cleaning routine, but my mind was racing. In the span of one meeting, I'd watched Victoria systematically destroy any remaining credibility she might have had. She'd blamed her team for her failures, lied about office morale, and demonstrated a complete inability to take responsibility for the declining performance under her leadership. But more importantly, I'd seen James Henderson recognize the real talent in this office, the same people Victoria had been systematically undermining and dismissing. That's when the plan began forming in my mind. Not revenge, exactly, but something more sophisticated, something that would address the systemic problems in this office, while giving talented people the recognition they deserved. I thought about the employee feedback folder I'd found in Victoria's office, full of dismissed suggestions and ignored proposals. I thought about Derek's creative insights, Amanda's strategic thinking, Jessica's enthusiasm for improvement, all of it wasted because Victoria saw employee initiative as a threat rather than an asset. What if those insights reached someone who would actually value them? What if the real talent in this office had a chance to demonstrate their capabilities without Victoria's interference? I looked around the office at Derek staring blankly at his computer screen, at Amanda organizing papers with mechanical precision, at Jessica typing with the defeated posture of someone whose ideas had been crushed too many times. They deserved better than Victoria's version of leadership. They deserved a chance to show what they could accomplish under someone who saw their potential instead of their presumed inadequacy. For months I'd been the invisible observer, documenting the dysfunction and learning about workplace dynamics from the bottom up. Now I had an opportunity to use that knowledge in service of something larger than personal vindication. It was time to stop being Natalie Ross, the cleaning girl who absorbed insults and endured humiliation. It was time to become Natalie Kensington, someone with the power to change things. But first, I needed to do something that would have seemed impossible 8 months ago. I needed to call my father and ask for his help, not as his daughter seeking rescue, but as someone who had identified a business problem that required a strategic solution. The transformation was complete. I just hadn't announced it yet. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment with my laptop open, staring at a blank document that would either launch my career as a real leader or destroy any credibility I might have earned over the past 8 months. The phone call to my father could wait. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was proposing and what the consequences would be for everyone involved. I'd spent months thinking like Natalie Ross, the invisible cleaning girl who observed and endured. Now I needed to think like Natalie Kensington, someone who would soon have the power to make decisions that affected real people's livelihoods, careers, and futures. The stakes were more complex than I'd initially realized. For Victoria, exposure of her incompetence would mean professional humiliation and almost certain termination. But as much as I disliked her management style, she was still a human being with a mortgage, family obligations, and a career that would be permanently damaged by a high-profile firing. Corporate America wasn't forgiving to middle-aged managers who lost major clients and alienated their teams. For my coworkers, the situation was equally precarious. Derek, Amanda, and Jessica had been operating under Victoria's leadership for years, which meant their professional reputations were tied to the office's declining performance. If I revealed my identity and triggered a management overhaul, would they be seen as part of the problem or as victims of poor leadership? Would new management recognize their potential, or would they be casualties of a corporate cleanup? For my father and Meridian Digital Solutions, the financial implications were substantial. The Riverside Heights office represented millions in annual revenue, and Henderson Industries alone was worth nearly $800,000 per year to the company. If Victoria's mismanagement had already cost us clients, and if Henderson pulled their account as seemed likely, the office might not survive regardless of who was in charge. But there was another layer of stakes I hadn't fully considered until now. My own future at Meridian. If I revealed my identity and took control of the situation, I would be stepping into a leadership role under the worst possible circumstances. Everyone would know I was the CEO's daughter who'd been secretly observing them for months. Some would see it as deceptive manipulation, others as necessary intelligence gathering. Either way, I would have to prove myself all over again. This time as someone with actual authority rather than someone earning respect through competence. I opened my leather journal and began reviewing 8 months of documentation. The picture that emerged was of an office caught in a death spiral. Declining performance leading to increased pressure from Victoria, which led to decreased morale and innovation, which led to further decline. The numbers were devastating when I really examined them. Client retention was down 37% from the previous year. Employee turnover had increased by 50%, with exit interviews consistently citing management issues and lack of growth opportunity. Project timelines were averaging 40% longer than industry standards, not because the work was complex, but because Victoria's micromanagement and constant revisions created inefficiency. Most damning of all, I discovered that the office's 3 biggest client losses this year, companies Victoria had blamed for being unreasonable, had all cited the same issues in their termination letters: poor communication, missed deadlines, and lack of strategic insight. In other words, they'd left because of leadership failures, not market conditions. But buried in all this dysfunction, I'd also documented extraordinary talent being systematically wasted. Derek's portfolio included designs that were innovative and strategic, but Victoria consistently forced him to water them down or revert to safer approaches that pleased no one. I'd found drafts of his work that were brilliant, concepts that could have won industry awards if they'd been allowed to reach clients in their original form. Amanda's client relationship skills were exceptional when Victoria wasn't interfering. I'd overheard her phone calls with clients, watched her handle difficult situations with diplomacy and creativity. But every successful interaction was undermined by Victoria's need to oversee all client communications, often contradicting Amanda's promises or changing strategies mid-project. Jessica's analytical skills were remarkable for someone her age. She developed workflow optimization suggestions that could have saved the office thousands of hours annually, but Victoria had dismissed them as overstepping and relegated Jessica to basic administrative tasks. The more I studied my documentation, the more I realized that this wasn't just about removing a bad manager, it was about unleashing potential that had been deliberately suppressed. Then I found something that changed everything. Buried in the financial records I'd had access to while organizing Victoria's filing system was a document I'd initially overlooked: a performance improvement plan from corporate, dated 6 months ago. Victoria was already on notice. Her superiors knew about the declining metrics, client losses, and employee complaints. She'd been given specific targets to meet: client retention goals, revenue benchmarks, and employee satisfaction metrics. She was failing every single one of them. According to the timeline outlined in the performance plan, Victoria had 3 more months to demonstrate significant and sustained improvement or face alternative employment arrangements. In corporate speak, she was already on her way out. The only question was whether she'd destroy more of the office before her inevitable termination. This discovery fundamentally changed the nature of what I was considering. I wouldn't be orchestrating Victoria's downfall, I'd be accelerating a process that was already in motion. The question was whether to let it play out naturally over the next 3 months, potentially losing more clients and damaging more careers in the process, or to intervene now with information that could expedite a necessary change. I thought about Derek spending another 3 months, having his creative work butchered. About Amanda watching more client relationships deteriorate due to Victoria's interference. About Jessica's enthusiasm being crushed further by constant dismissal of her idea. I thought about the Henderson Industries account, probably already lost, and how many other clients might follow if nothing changed quickly. Most importantly, I thought about what kind of leader I wanted to become. Did I want to be someone who waited for problems to solve themselves, or someone who took action when they had the power to make positive changes? The phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed my father's number. "How did the Henderson meeting go?" he asked without preamble. "I heard James was visiting your office today." I realized this was the moment of truth. I could give him a surface-level report about what I'd observed, maintaining my cover as the cleaning girl learning about workplace dynamics, or I could step into my real identity and present this as the business problem it actually was. "Dad," I said carefully, "how much do you know about the management situation at the Riverside Heights office?" There was a pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because I think we need to talk. Not about my character-building exercise, but about a serious operational problem that's costing the company money and damaging employee morale." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you ready to stop being Natalie Ross?" "I think Natalie Ross has learned everything she needed to learn. It's time for Natalie Kensington to start solving problems." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said. "And Natalie, bring your documentation." As I hung up the phone, I realized the stakes had just changed again. This wasn't about my personal transformation anymore, or even about getting justice for months of humiliation. This was about proving I could identify systemic problems, analyze complex situations, and propose solutions that served the company's best interests, rather than my own ego. In 12 hours, I would walk into that office for the last time as the invisible cleaning girl. By the end of the day, everyone would know exactly who I really was and what I was capable of when I finally stopped hiding. The experiment was over. The real test was about to begin. I arrived at the office at 5:30 a.m. that Monday morning, 30 minutes earlier than usual, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 8 months of carefully documented evidence and a plan that would either establish my credibility as a future leader or expose me as an entitled daughter playing with people's lives. My father would arrive at 9 a.m. for what Victoria believed was a routine corporate visit. She had no idea that Theodore Kensington was coming specifically to evaluate her performance based on intelligence gathered by the cleaning girl she'd spent months humiliating. But first, I had work to do. I'd spent the weekend crafting what I privately called the Henderson Report, a comprehensive analysis of the office's operational failures, client retention issues, and management problems, supported by specific examples, documented incidents, and measurable data. More importantly, I'd developed a detailed transition plan that could salvage the remaining client relationships while positioning the office's talented employees for success under new leadership. The report was written in Natalie Kensington's voice, analytical, strategic, and focused on solutions rather than blame. Reading it, you'd never guess it had been compiled by someone who spent her days emptying trash cans and scrubbing toilets. As I moved through the empty office, I placed 3 identical folders in strategic locations, one on Derek's desk, one on Amanda's workstation, and one at Jessica's computer. Each folder contained personalized documentation of their suppressed contributions, client feedback about their work that Victoria had never shared, and specific recommendations for how their roles could be expanded under competent management. The folders were labeled simply "For your review, confidential management assessment." Inside Derek's folder was a compilation of client feedback about his creative work, including comments from Henderson Industries praising his innovative approach and strategic thinking, feedback that Victoria had received but never passed along. I'd also included examples of his original design concepts alongside the watered-down versions Victoria had forced him to implement, demonstrating the gap between his potential and what he'd been allowed to produce. Amanda's folder contained documentation of her client relationship successes, including 3 instances where she'd prevented account cancellations through skilled crisis management. Again, achievements that Victoria had claimed credit for in her reports to corp. I'd tracked Amanda's original strategic recommendations against actual project outcomes, showing that her ignored suggestions would have prevented 2 of the year's major client losses. Jessica's folder was perhaps the most damning evidence of Victoria's poor leadership. It contained Jessica's workflow optimization proposals alongside calculations, showing they could have saved the office approximately $180,000 annually in efficiency gains and overtime costs. I'd also documented 6 separate instances where Jessica had identified potential problems early, only to have her warnings dismissed as inexperience. The message was clear: this office's problems weren't due to lack of talent or market conditions, but to leadership that actively suppressed the very qualities that could have ensured success. At 7 a.m., I positioned myself in the supply closet with a clear view of the office entrance. My plan required precise timing and careful observation of how each person reacted to discovering that someone had been documenting their professional capabilities in detail. Derek arrived first, as always, carrying his oversized coffee and looking like someone who'd given up hope of his work being appreciated. I watched through the supply closet door as he noticed the folder, opened it with casual curiosity, then went completely still as he read the content. His transformation was immediate and fascinating. His posture straightened, his expression shifted from resigned indifference to focused attention, and he began pulling up files on his computer, not the current projects Victoria had assigned, but his original concepts and strategic proposal. For the first time in months, Derek looked like someone who remembered his own professional worth. Amanda arrived 20 minutes later, her usual brisk efficiency barely concealing the stress that had become her baseline state under Victoria's management. When she found her folder, she read it standing up, one hand pressed to her mouth as she processed documentation of achievements she'd begun to doubt had any value. I watched her pull out her phone and take pictures of the client feedback quotes as if she needed proof that her work had actually mattered to someone. Then she opened her laptop and began reviewing her dormant strategic recommendations with the intensity of someone rediscovering her own expertise. Jessica was the last to arrive, rushing in with the slightly frantic energy of someone who'd learned that being 5 minutes late could result in a public lecture about professionalism. Her reaction to the folder was the most emotional. She actually sat down hard in her chair and stared at the documents for a full 10 minutes. When she finally moved, it was to pull out a notebook and begin writing with fierce determination. I could see her reviewing her dismissed proposals, cross-referencing them with current office problems, and developing what looked like an updated analysis based on additional months of observation. By 8:30, all three of them were working with a focus and energy I hadn't seen since starting this job. They weren't just going through the motions of their assigned tasks, they were thinking strategically, reviewing their suppressed ideas and preparing for what they'd clearly realized was going to be a significant conversation about the office's future. Victoria arrived at 8:45, later than usual but early enough to notice the unusual atmosphere in the office. Derek was at the printer making copies of design concepts. Amanda was on the phone with what sounded like a client relationship call that went beyond her normal scope. Jessica was organizing documents with the kind of systematic approach that suggested she was preparing a presentation. "What's everyone so busy with this morning?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying that edge of suspicion that appeared whenever she sensed her employees showing initiative without her explicit direction. "Just catching up on some projects," Derek replied without looking up from his work. His tone was polite but distant, professional courtesy without the usual deference Victoria demanded. Amanda finished her phone call and turned to Victoria with an expression I'd never seen before, confident, direct, unintimidated. "I've been reviewing our client retention strategies," she said. "I think we need to have a conversation about some operational improvements." Victoria's face shifted through several expressions as she processed this unprecedented display of employee initiative. Before she could respond, Jessica approached with a folder of her own. "I've updated my workflow analysis from last spring," Jessica said quietly. "Given recent events, I thought it might be worth revisiting some of those efficiency recommendations." I could see Victoria's mind racing as she tried to understand why her carefully controlled employees were suddenly acting like independent professionals with their own ideas and agenda. The balance of power in the office had shifted overnight, and she could feel it even if she couldn't explain it. "We'll discuss any operational changes after I meet with Mr. Kensington," Victoria said, her voice tight with the effort of maintaining authority over people who were no longer deferring to her automatically. As if summoned by her words, my father's black sedan pulled into the parking lot exactly at 9. Through the office windows I could see him gathering his briefcase and checking his phone, the picture of corporate authority arriving for what Victoria believed was a routine executive visit. What she didn't know was that Theodore Kensington had spent the weekend reviewing his daughter's comprehensive analysis of systemic management failures, and that he was walking into this office armed with 8 months of detailed documentation about leadership incompetence. The pieces were in place. The talented employees had been reminded of their own professional worth and were prepared to advocate for themselves. Victoria was off balance and defensive, uncertain why her usual control tactics weren't working. And my father was about to discover that his character-building experiment had produced not just a more grounded daughter, but a detailed case study in everything that could go wrong when the wrong person was given power over the right people. I adjusted my cleaning supplies and prepared for the performance of my life. In the next hour I would transform from Natalie Ross, the invisible cleaning girl, to Natalie Kensington, someone with the power to change everything. The question was whether I could pull off the transition with the kind of leadership presence that would earn respect rather than resentment from people who were about to learn they'd been unknowingly performing for the boss's daughter all along. Theodore Kensington walked through the office doors at exactly 9, and I watched Victoria's entire demeanor shift into what I'd come to recognize as her performing for corporate mode, a careful blend of confidence and deference that she'd perfected for occasions when her job security depended on making the right impression. "Miss Kensington," she said, crossing the office with practiced enthusiasm, "welcome to Riverside Heights. I'm so pleased you could visit us today." My father shook her hand with the kind of polite professionalism that revealed nothing about his intentions. "Miss Steinberg, I appreciate you making time on short notice. Of course, I've prepared a comprehensive overview of our recent performance metrics and some exciting initiatives we're implementing for the coming quarter." I could see Derek, Amanda and Jessica watching this interaction from their desks, their earlier confidence now mixed with nervous energy as they sensed something significant was about to happen. They had no idea that the corporate executive standing in their office was about to hear 8 months of documented evidence about their manager's systematic destruction of workplace morale and operational efficiency. "Actually," my father said, glancing around the office with the kind of careful attention that made Victoria fidget slightly, "I'd like to start with a brief conversation with your facilities coordinator. I understand there have been operational observations that might be relevant to our discussion." Victoria's confusion was immediate and visible. "Our facilities coordinator? You mean Natalie?" I'm not sure what operational insights she could provide, but where is she now?" my father asked, his tone casual but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. "I believe she's in the supply area," Victoria replied, clearly baffled by the direction of this conversation. "But surely our time would be better spent reviewing actual business metrics, rather than Ms. Ross." My father called out using the name I'd been operating under for 8 months. "Could you join us, please?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for since I emerged from the supply closet carrying my cleaning supplies and the leather portfolio that contained everything Victoria had never suspected I was documenting. "Yes, sir," I said, playing my role as the deferential employee for what I knew would be the last time. Victoria looked between my father and me with growing confusion. "Mr. Kensington, I'm not sure why you need to speak with our cleaning staff about Miss Steinberg," my father interrupted, his voice taking on the tone he used for board meetings when patience was running thin. "I'd like you to meet Natalie Kensington, my daughter, and for the past 8 months, your most observant employee." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hum of the air conditioning system. Victoria's face went through a fascinating series of changes: confusion, disbelief, understanding, and finally a kind of horror as she began to process what this revelation meant. Derek's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Amanda actually stood up from her chair. Jessica made a small sound that might have been a gasp. "Your daughter?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Natalie has been conducting what you might call an operational assessment," my father continued smoothly. 8 months of direct observation, documentation, and analysis. I believe she has some findings to share. I set down my cleaning supplies, a symbolic gesture that felt remarkably satisfying, and opened my portfolio. "Ms. Steinberg, over the past 8 months, I've documented systematic management failures that have resulted in a 37% decline in client retention, a 50% increase in employee turnover, and operational inefficiencies that have cost this office approximately $40,000 in lost revenue and productivity." Victoria's face had gone completely white. "You've been spying on us. Lying about who you are." "I've been working," I replied calmly. "The same job you assigned me, The only difference is that I was also analyzing why this office is failing, despite having exceptional talent. I turned to address the rest of the office, where Derek, Amanda, and Jessica were staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to what might have been relief. Derek, your creative concepts for the Morrison campaign were brilliant. The original versions, before they were revised to be safer. Henderson Industries specifically praised your strategic thinking. Amanda, your crisis management with the Blackstone account last month prevented a cancellation that would have cost us $200,000. Victoria found her voice, and it came out as an angry whisper. You had no right to deceive us, to manipulate this situation. I had every right to assess the operational efficiency of a company office. I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. What I found was talented employees being systematically undermined by leadership that mistakes control for competence. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the Henderson Industries folder. Friday's meeting with James Henderson was a perfect example. You blamed Derek for time management issues when the delays were caused by your micromanagement. You told Mr. Henderson that team morale was excellent, while sitting 20 feet from employees who spend their days afraid to suggest improvement. That's not, Victoria started, but my father held up a hand. Miss Steinberg, I've reviewed my daughter's documentation, 8 months of detailed observations, recorded incidents, and performance analysis. Would you like to respond to specific examples? Victoria looked around the office desperately, as if hoping someone would come to her defense. But Derek was studying his hands. Amanda was organizing papers with mechanical precision, and Jessica was staring at her computer screen. I've worked hard to maintain professional standards, Victoria said finally. If there have been communication issues, they're hardly unique to our industry. Management requires making difficult decisions that aren't always popular. Let me read you something, I said, pulling out my journal. October 15th. People like you think you can just coast through life without consequences. No education, no ambition, no respect for other people's success. You're exactly where you belong, cleaning up other people's messes, because you're too incompetent to create anything worthwhile yourself. The office was so quiet I could hear Victoria's breathing. That's what you said to me after you lost your Henderson files. Does that sound like professional management to you? Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. You set me. You've been planning this whole elaborate revenge scheme. I've been documenting workplace dysfunction, I interrupted. The fact that your own words condemn you isn't my fault. My father stepped forward, his presence filling the space with unmistakable authority. Miss Steinberg, you're already on a performance improvement plan. Your client retention is below acceptable standards. Your team productivity has declined significantly. And now I have documented evidence of management practices that violate our corporate policies on workplace respect and employee development. Victoria seemed to shrink as the full weight of her situation became clear. Mr. Kensington, surely we can discuss this privately. I've been under tremendous pressure. The discussion is concluded, my father said with finality. You'll be meeting with HR this afternoon to discuss your departure package. Miss Kensington will be assuming interim management responsibilities while we implement a permanent solution. I saw Derek's head snap up, Amanda's eyes widen, and Jessica actually smile for the first time in months. Victoria stared at me with something approaching hatred. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? They'll never respect you. They know you've been lying to them for months. For the first time since this confrontation began, You're right that I'll have to earn their respect, but I'll do it the same way I've done everything else for the past 8 months, through competence, hard work, and treating people like they matter. I turned to face Derek, Amanda, and Jessica direct. I know this is shocking, and I know you probably feel deceived, but everything in those folders on your desks is real. Your work has value. Your ideas matter. And you deserve leadership that recognizes your potential instead of suppressing it. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice quiet but clear. Those workflow proposals, did you really calculate the savings? On $180,000 annually, I confirmed. And that's just from your initial suggestions. With proper support and resources, you could probably double that impact. Derek cleared his throat. The client feedback. Henderson really said those things about my work. James Henderson personally complimented your innovative thinking. He just didn't know whether you'd ever get credit for it under the current management structure. Amanda stood up slowly, and I could see her making a decision. What happens now? I looked at my father, then back at the three people who would determine whether this transition succeeded or failed. Now we find out if I can be the kind of leader this office deserves. And you find out if you're ready to work for someone who values your contributions instead of fearing them. The old Natalie, both Ross and Kensington, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that true power came not from inherited authority, but from understanding people well enough to help them become their best professional selves. The real work was just beginning. The first hour after Victoria's departure was deceptively calm. My father had left to handle the HR logistics, promising to return the following morning to discuss the transition plan. Derek, Amanda and Jessica had returned to their desks with the kind of careful politeness that suggested they were still processing what had just happened. I sat in Victoria's former office, my office now staring at the space that had been the command center for 8 months of systematic workplace dysfunction. Then the resistance began. It started with a phone call at 11:30 a.m. The receptionist transferred it to my line with obvious confusion. Miss Kensington, there's someone from Henderson Industries on the phone. They're asking about account discontinuation. My stomach dropped as I picked up the call. This is Natalie Kensington. Miss Kensington, this is Rebecca Walsh from Henderson Industries Procurement Department. We received some concerning communication this morning from a Victoria Steinberg, claiming that there had been a management transition at your office and that we should expect service disruptions. She suggested we might want to consider alternative providers during this instability. I closed my eyes and counted to 3. Victoria had made her first countermove within an hour of being terminated. Ms. Walsh, I can assure you that our service delivery will remain completely uninterrupted. In fact, I believe you'll find our communication and project management will improve significantly under the new structure. I see. And you're the new manager. I've been conducting operational assessments here for several months, and I'm very familiar with your account's specific needs and preferences. There was a pause. Mrs. Steinberg also mentioned that the previous management transition involved some kind of family nepotism situation. She seemed quite concerned about the professional integrity of future service delivery. I felt anger rise in my throat, but forced my voice to remain steady. Ms. Walsh, I'd be happy to schedule a meeting with you and Ms. Henderson to discuss our transition plan and address any concerns you might have about service quality. Would this afternoon work for your schedule? Yes, actually. Mr. Henderson is still in town. Could you come to our hotel at 2? After hanging up, I realized Victoria's revenge strategy was becoming clear. She was going to systematically undermine my credibility with every client, vendor and business contact she could reach, and she was starting with our most important account. The phone rang again, 20 minutes later. This time it was Marcus Chen from Redwood Marketing Group, one of our smaller but growing accounts. Miss Kensington, I just received a very strange call from someone claiming to be your former office manager. She suggested that there might be some billing irregularities that we should be aware of, and that the new management might not honor previously negotiated rates. Victoria was getting creative. She was implying financial impropriety, without making specific accusations that could get her in legal trouble. By lunchtime I'd fielded 6 similar calls. Victoria had contacted our print vendor, claiming I might not authorize payment for pending orders. She'd called our freelance photographers suggesting they should demand payment upfront for future projects. She'd even reached out to our landlord with vague warnings about management instability that might affect lease obligations. But the real crisis hit at 1:15 p.m., when Derek appeared in my doorway looking shaken. Natalie, he said quietly, I just got off the phone with Sarah Martinez from Creative Solutions Network. She's the recruiter who helped me get this job 3 years ago. I felt my stomach tighten. What did she want? She said she'd received a call from someone at Meridian expressing concern about my attitude problems and suggesting that my recent performance review had raised questions about my ability to work collaboratively with management. I stared at him. Victoria called your recruiter. Apparently, Sarah was calling to give me a heads up that there might be some negative references floating around if I started job hunting. She wanted to know if I was having problems here that I hadn't mentioned. This was worse than client sabotage. Victoria was trying to destroy my employees' external professional reputations, making it harder for them to leave if they decided they didn't want to work for me. Amanda appeared behind Derek, her face pale. I just got a similar call. Someone contacted my professional network suggesting that I'd been involved in some kind of client relations issues that led to account losses. Jessica joined them, looking like she might cry. My former professor from business school called. Someone told her I was on probation for performance issues, and suggested she might want to reconsider her recommendation letters for my graduate school applications. I stood up slowly, feeling the full weight of what Victoria was doing. She wasn't just trying to undermine my leadership, she was attempting to destroy the career prospects of everyone who might support me. It was scorched earth warfare designed to make my success impossible. She's trying to isolate us, I said, thinking out loud. If she can convince our clients we're unstable, our vendors were financially risky, and our employees that their careers are in jeopardy, then my management transition fails before it even begins. Derek nodded grimly. And if you fail spectacularly enough, it proves her point that the office problems weren't her fault. The phone rang again. This time it was my father. Natalie, I just heard from regional. They've received 3 anonymous complaints in the past 2 hours alleging workplace harassment, financial irregularities, and abuse of corporate resources. All filed against you personally. I sat down hard. Anonymous complaint. Someone is claiming you used your position to spy on employees, that you manipulated documentation to frame a manager for failures that were actually systemic, and that you've created a hostile work environment through deception and power abuse. The brilliance of Victoria's strategy was becoming clear. She was using the very fact that I'd worked undercover for 8 months as evidence that I was manipulative and untrustworthy. She was reframing my documentation as vindictive surveillance rather than legitimate business analysis. Dad, these allegations, I know they're false, but HR has to investigate. Corporate policy requires a formal review process when multiple complaints are filed against any manager, especially one in a new position. I felt the walls closing in. How long does the investigation take? Minimum 2 weeks, during which time you'll be on administrative leave, pending the outcome. Administrative leave, my voice came out higher than I intended. Dad, that's exactly what she wants. 2 weeks without leadership gives her time to completely destroy client relationships and employee morale. Natalie, I can't appear to be giving you special treatment, because you're my daughter. That would validate every accusation she's making about nepotism and corporate favoritism. I hung up and looked at Derek, Amanda, and Jessica, who had obviously overheard enough to understand what was happening. So what now? Amanda asked quietly. That's when I realized Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that attacking my employees would make them want to distance themselves from me. Instead, she demonstrated exactly the kind of vindictive, destructive leadership they'd been enduring for years. Now, I said, standing up with renewed determination, we prove that good leadership can survive attacks from bad leadership. We show our clients that this office runs better without Victoria, not worse. We demonstrate to HR that the only hostile work environment here was the one she created. Jessica looked uncertain. But how do we do that when you're going to be on administrative leave? I smiled, feeling the same strategic clarity that had guided me through 8 months of careful observation and document. We do it the same way I've been doing everything else, through competence, preparation, and refusing to let someone else's dysfunction define our success. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since this crisis started, I wasn't facing it alone. The Henderson Industries meeting at 2 p.m. was my last chance to prove that Victoria's sabotage couldn't destroy what we'd built, and I walked into that hotel conference room knowing that everything I'd worked for over the past 8 months hung in the balance. James Henderson sat across from me with the same carefully neutral expression he'd worn during Victoria's failed presentation, but this time he was accompanied by Rebecca Walsh and their legal counsel, never a good sign in client meetings. Kensington, Henderson began without preamble, we've received some concerning communications today about the management transition at your office. Before we discuss our ongoing partnership, I need to understand exactly what happened and what it means for service delivery. I opened my portfolio, the same one that had contained 8 months of documentation, now reorganized to focus on solutions rather than problems. Mr. Henderson, I want to be completely transparent about the situation. My former manager was terminated today due to documented performance issues and management practices that violated corporate policies. I've been appointed as interim manager to ensure continuity of service and implementation of immediate improvements. Rebecca Walsh leaned forward. Steinberg suggested that this transition involved some kind of family politics rather than legitimate business concerns. She was quite specific about alleged irregularities. Here was the moment of truth. I could deflect, minimize, or try to discredit Victoria's version of events. Instead, I chose complete honesty. Mr. Henderson, I'm Theodore Kensington's daughter. For the past 8 months, I worked in this office under an assumed identity as part of an operational assessment. What I documented was systematic dysfunction that was costing our company clients and damaging employee morale. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Henderson's expression didn't change, but I saw his legal counsel make a note. You were working undercover? Rebecca asked, her tone carefully controlled. I was working, I replied simply. The same job Victoria assigned me, facilities maintenance. The difference was that I was also analyzing operational efficiency and management effectiveness. Henderson finally spoke. And what did your analysis reveal? I pulled out 3 specific examples, all directly related to their account. First, your Morrison campaign timeline was extended by 6 weeks due to unnecessary revision cycles that could have been avoided with better project management. Second, your concerns about communication delays were valid. There were systematic bottlenecks in our approval process that I've now streamlined. Third, your feedback about creative quality was suppressed rather than addressed. I slid a document across the table. This is Derek Thornfield's original concept for your campaign. The version before it was revised to be safer. I believe this is closer to the innovative thinking you were looking for. Henderson studied the design for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. This is significantly stronger than what we approved. Derek is an exceptional creative director whose work was being systematically undermined. Under the new structure, you'll be working directly with talent instead of through management filters that dilute strategic thinking. Rebecca looked at her notes. Steinberg also mentioned billing irregularities and concerns about service disruption during this transition. Miss Steinberg was terminated for cause, I said directly. Her claims about irregularities are part of a coordinated effort to undermine the transition. I have documentation of every project timeline, billing cycle, and service delivery metric for your account over the past 8 months. I pulled out another folder. Your account has been consistently profitable and on schedule. The only disruptions have been caused by management practices that we've now corrected. Henderson's legal counsel spoke for the first time. This is an unusual situation. Working undercover in your own company's office raises questions about transparency and employee trust. You're absolutely right, I acknowledged. It was unusual, and it required deception that I don't take lightly. But the results speak for themselves. We identified and addressed problems that were systematically damaging client relationships and employee performance. I looked directly at Henderson. You've worked with my father for years. You know he doesn't make decisions lightly or tolerate poor performance. This transition happened because the previous management was failing, not because of family politics. Henderson was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the documents I'd provided. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd made a decision. Miss Kensington, assuming your service delivery matches your analysis, we'll continue the partnership, but we want monthly performance reviews for the next 6 months, and direct access to your creative and account management teams. Absolutely, I agreed, feeling relief flood through me. But as I walked back to the office, my phone rang with news that shattered any sense of victory. It was Derek, and his voice was tight with controlled panic. Natalie, we have a problem. Amanda just left. Left for the day. Left permanently. She cleaned out her desk and submitted her resignation to HR 20 minutes ago. I stopped walking. What happened? Victoria called her mother. Amanda's mom works for a marketing firm in Denver, and someone contacted her supervisor suggesting that Amanda was involved in some kind of professional misconduct. Her mother called her crying, afraid that Amanda's reputation was being destroyed and that it might affect her own job. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Where is Amanda now? She took a job offer she'd been considering in Phoenix. She's flying out tonight. She said she couldn't risk her family's careers getting caught up in whatever Victoria is planning. When I reached the office, Jessica was at her desk staring at her computer screen with tears in her eyes. My graduate school application was withdrawn, she said without looking up. The admissions committee received a letter from someone claiming to represent Meridian HR, suggesting that I was under investigation for performance issues and recommending they reconsider my candidacy. I sat down heavily, feeling the full weight of Victoria's strategy crystallize. She wasn't just attacking our professional reputations, she was targeting the people we cared about, the opportunities we'd worked for, the futures we'd planned. Jessica, we can fix this, we can contact the admissions committee, provide documentation. It doesn't matter, she interrupted. Even if they believe us, there's always going to be doubt. There's always going to be a question about whether I was really involved in something inappropriate. Derek appeared in the doorway. I just got another call. This time it was my ex-wife's attorney. Someone contacted them suggesting that my income might be unstable due to workplace issues, and that they should revisit child support arrangements. I stared at him. She's attacking your family. My kids, Derek said quietly. She's using my children as leverage to force me out. That's when I understood the true scope of Victoria's revenge. This wasn't about professional sabotage or business competition. This was about destroying people's lives systematically and completely, using their love for family members as weapons against them. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This is just the beginning. Every client, every vendor, every professional contact, every family member. I will make sure that working for you destroys everyone who tries. Victoria had signed her message with her initials, wanting me to know exactly who was orchestrating this campaign of destruction. I looked around the office at Jessica crying over her ruined graduate school prospects, at Derek calculating whether he could afford a custody battle, at Amanda's empty desk where her resignation letter sat like a surrender flag. For the first time since starting this job, I felt completely defeated. Not because of the professional challenges or the business problems, but because good people who had trusted me were paying the price for my decision to challenge a vindictive manager. I had won the battle for control of the office, but Victoria was winning the war for the hearts and minds of everyone I needed to succeed. The question was no longer whether I could be an effective leader. The question was whether I was willing to watch good people suffer for my ambitions, or whether I should step aside and let them rebuild their careers without the target that came from association with me. As I sat in my office, surrounded by the documentation of months of careful planning and strategic thinking, I realized that sometimes the most important leadership decision is knowing when to sacrifice yourself to protect the people who trusted you. Victoria had given me an impossible choice: fight back and watch more good people get destroyed, or surrender and let her prove that decent leadership couldn't survive against sustained cruelty. Either way, she would get what she'd wanted from the beginning. Proof that people like me, people who tried to do the right thing, would always lose to people willing to do anything to win. The only question was whether I had the strength to prove her wrong, or the wisdom to know when the cost of fighting had become too high. I spent that night in my small apartment, surrounded by 8 months of documentation that suddenly felt meaningless. Victoria's final text message sat on my phone like a death sentence. This is just the beginning. She was systematically destroying everyone who had trusted me, using their families and futures as weapons in a war I'd started but couldn't seem to win. At 3 a.m., I made a decision that would have horrified the naive girl who'd laughed off her father's challenge nearly a year ago. I called the one person who could end this immediately. Dad, I need you to reinstate Victoria. There was a long pause. Natalie, it's 3 in the morning. I need you to bring her back, publicly apologize for the misunderstanding, and put me on permanent administrative leave. Make it clear that the investigation found issues with my conduct, not hers. Absolutely not. Dad, she's destroying people, not just their careers, their families, their children, their futures. Amanda's already gone. Derek might lose custody of his kids. Jessica's graduate school dreams are ruined. This isn't about business anymore. It's about whether I'm willing to watch good people suffer for my ambition. My father was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Natalie, In 30 years of business, I've learned that there are two kinds of leaders. Ones who fold when things get difficult, and ones who find a way to protect their people while still doing what's right. Which kind do you want to be? The kind that doesn't destroy innocent people, the kind that lets bullies win. I stared at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, feeling the weight of impossible choices. What am I supposed to do, Dad? Fight back the same way she's fighting? Attack her family? Destroy her reputation? Become exactly the kind of person I was trying to remove from leadership? No, he said quietly. You become the kind of leader who's strong enough to protect people without becoming what you're fighting against. That's when it hit me. I'd been playing Victoria's game, fighting on her terms, accepting her definition of victory and defeat. But real leadership wasn't about winning corporate warfare, it was about creating environments where good people could thrive. I spent the next 6 hours crafting what I privately called the Victoria Solution. Not a counterattack, but something far more devastating to someone who thrived on chaos and conflict. Systematic, professional, irrelevant. At 9 a.m., I walked into the office with a plan that would either establish me as a leader worth following, or confirm that I wasn't ready for the responsibility I'd claimed. Derek and Jessica were at their desks, both looking like soldiers awaiting execution. The office felt hollow without Amanda's steady presence, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they wondered who would be targeted next. I want to show you something, I said, pulling up a document on my laptop. This is a comprehensive counter-strategy that will neutralize Victoria's attacks without requiring us to become like her. Jessica looked skeptical. How do you fight someone who's willing to attack families without attacking back? You make her irrelevant, I replied, opening my proposal. First, we're implementing an employee protection protocol. Every person in this office will have documented proof of their performance excellence, client satisfaction ratings, and professional contribution. If anyone tries to sabotage their external reputation, we have immediate evidence to counter false claims. Derek leaned forward. That helps defensively, but what about the ongoing attacks? We're going on offense, but not against Victoria. We're going after her client. I pulled up a list of companies that had worked with Victoria at previous positions. I've researched every account she managed over the past 5 years. The pattern is consistent: initial success followed by declining performance, and eventual client loss. I showed them client retention statistics that painted a devastating picture. Victoria's career trajectory shows a clear pattern of short-term gains, followed by long-term failure. We're going to document this pattern and share it with industry contacts, not as character assassination, but as professional performance analysis. Jessica's eyes widened. You're proving she's systemically incompetent. I'm proving that her management style creates predictable business failures. Companies that hire her can expect 18 months of acceptable performance, followed by significant client losses and team dysfunction. But the real breakthrough came when Derek made a connection I hadn't seen. Natalie, what if we don't just defend against her attacks? What if we actively recruit the people she's trying to destroy? I stared at him. What do you mean? Amanda didn't want to leave, she felt forced out. What if we create a consulting partnership with her Phoenix firm? She keeps her new job security, but we get her strategic expertise on a contract basis. The idea was brilliant. Instead of trying to bring people back into a toxic situation, we could create external partnerships that protected them from Victoria's reach, while still benefiting from their talent. Within 2 hours, we'd outlined a revolutionary approach to team building. Rather than traditional employment, we'd create a network of strategic partnerships with talented professionals who could contribute to our success without becoming targets for Victoria's vindictive campaign. Amanda agreed to the consulting arrangement immediately. I can provide strategic support without being vulnerable to attacks on my family, she said during our video call. And frankly, working with you part-time while building my career in Phoenix feels like the best of both worlds. By the end of the week, we'd assembled what I called the Excellence Network, 12 former Meridian employees, who'd left due to Victoria's management style, all willing to work with us on a consulting basis. We had access to more talent and expertise than ever before, but none of them were vulnerable to employment-based sabotage. The turning point came 3 weeks later when Henderson Industries called with an unexpected request. Kensington, James Henderson said, "We've been so impressed with the improvement in service quality that we'd like to discuss expanding our partnership. Also, we've been contacted by Victoria Steinberg about potential consulting work. Based on our experience with management transitions, we wanted to get your perspective on her capabilities. I could have destroyed Victoria with a single conversation, could have detailed every failure, every cruel interaction, every documented instance of poor leadership. Instead, I made a choice that defined what kind of leader I wanted to become. Mr. Henderson, I don't provide references for former employees, positive or negative. What I can tell you is that we're focused on building strategic partnerships with people who share our values of excellence, collaboration, and mutual respect. After I hung up, Derek looked at me with something approaching awe. You could have ended her consulting career with one phone call, and then I would have become exactly what she is, someone who destroys people for personal satisfaction. That's not leadership, that's just revenge with better justification. 6 months later, the Riverside Heights office had the highest client satisfaction ratings in Meridian's network. Our employee retention was perfect, not because people couldn't leave, but because they didn't want to. Our revenue had increased 43%, and we'd become the model for other offices struggling with management transition. Victoria had found other employment, though her pattern of short-term success followed by long-term failure continued at her new company. I didn't monitor her career or seek updates on her professional struggles. Her irrelevance to my success was complete and permanent. The girl who'd started this journey believing that respect came from position and authority had learned that real power came from creating environments where people could succeed. The woman who'd been humiliated by someone who mistook cruelty for strength had discovered that true leadership meant protecting people without destroying enemies. Today, when young professionals ask me about handling workplace conflict and toxic management, I tell them this: you can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you treat people. You can't prevent others from being cruel, but you can refuse to let their cruelty define your character. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to someone who thrives on conflict is to make them irrelevant to your success. Victoria taught me what leadership looked like when it was driven by fear, insecurity, and the need to control others. In learning to be everything she wasn't, I discovered what I was capable of becoming. The cleaning girl who'd spent 8 months observing workplace dysfunction had transformed into a leader who understood that real strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the wisdom to build something better than what you're replacing. And that transformation from victim to victor to something far more important, a leader worth following, was the most valuable education I could have received. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.